And somehow the entire B2B industry has kind of fallen for that lie. Often sit internally and make a bunch of assumptions as to what's happening in our customer land or competitive landscape. This to me is the biggest missed opportunity. More and more vendors are doing it now. If you don't do it, you're actually behind the pack.
Welcome to the REV UP Rebellion, the podcast for revenue leaders rewriting the rules of growth. I'm your host, Abbie White, and in each episode, we are going to bring you unfiltered conversations with disruptors, top-performing leaders, and real-world experts who will share their battle-tested insights. Today, we've got with us Cian McLoughlin, who is a global win-loss expert, specializing particularly around high-value, complex deals. Cian is the CEO and founder of Trinity. Welcome to today's podcast. Cian, I want to start with a big question. I'm really curious. What conversation do you feel right now from what you're seeing in market? Sales leaders, revenue leaders, they're just not having the conversation. It's not really on the table, but they really should. What conversation is missing from the table right now?
I think it's almost not what conversation, it's what stakeholder, because I think we need to bring our customers inside the tent way more than we do. I think we often sit internally and make a bunch of assumptions, and we have this kind of narrative that we form amongst ourselves as to what's happening in our customer land or competitive landscape, or how is AI evolving, or how are all these things changing. And they're great conversations to have, but I think if you have some loyal long-term customers, my strong advice is we need to bring them inside the tent more often. We need to just sit and have open, candid, constructive conversations with them. What are you seeing? What's changing? How could we do better?
Yeah.
Where would you like us to push more? And where would you like us to sort of, wait for you to draw us in? I think, and not just at the sales leadership and the CRO level, but also at the sales rep level, there's so many opportunities to get a second bite of the cherry by engaging with our customers. I will always send a proposal to an internal sponsor first and say, can you just redline this? Can you tell me where I'm missing the mark? And you get 2 bites of the cherry. Or if you've got a really important presentation, invite them in for the dry run and say, look, we'd love to have you. We're going to do a dry run on Tuesday ahead of Friday's meeting. You're welcome to attend. They won't always say yes, but when they do, it's so powerful. A couple of the biggest deals I've ever closed in my own career were through having an internal sponsor come in and say, Cian, that's appalling. You're so far off. Don't do that in front of our CEO. You're gonna kill it. And you're like, oh no. But then you've got some time and you've had that feedback and you have the second bite of the cherry. So I think sometimes we put our customers up on a pedestal and we think we have to have all the answers and show up in that way. And actually, I think that's completely the wrong approach. We just need to let them know that we value their feedback and let them know that we don't know everything and that we're really open to some guidance, some advice. And customers are just people. They'll lean into that and they'll be super supportive. So I think there's an awful lot of conversations, but I think there's a stakeholder that's missing from most of them, and that's the customer.
And how do you recommend, I guess in your first example around the customer feedback piece, not necessarily on a proposal or a deal, but just overall, like, where are you at? What's going on? Do you typically encourage people to do it in a more formal setting where some people will have like almost like that round table or that quarterly or like that like informal board type thing with like the voice of the customer? Or is it more like actually the one-to-one, like, give me the real juice? How do you get the best outcome there?
I think it's both. I think, I think having that kind of advisory panel, more formal, structured once a quarter where, you bring them in and then you leave them to it and you let them have that opportunity to sort of, talk amongst themselves and then give you some guidance and advice collectively. I think there's a lot of value in that if it's done genuinely. Sometimes those things are kind of a box tick and the output from those conversations don't necessarily flow into action. That to me is a real missed opportunity, because what it's effectively saying to those stakeholders is we don't really care what you have to say because we're not going to take any action on it. So I think you have to put some teeth into those kind of activities. But I think on the flip side, it's knowing enough customers that you can go out and just sit and have a coffee with them and talk to them and hear what's happening in their industry, see what's coming over the hill, hear what they're worrying about, share ideas around the things that you're hearing in market and what they're hearing in market. I think the thought leadership piece is important in that we bring them insight and ideas and innovation. But on the flip side, we don't pretend to have all the answers. And not every conversation needs to be a sales conversation.
Yeah.
And I think if it is, what happens is you lose your credibility a little bit, and and they stop saying yes to those cups of coffee because it just feels like it's going to be an overt or a covert sales pitch, and nobody wants to be sold to, but everybody wants to be helped.
Yeah, there's that sting in the tail.
Exactly.
Yeah. The other thing I really want to talk to you about is your book around Rebirth of the Salesperson. I think that there's a really interesting conversation now, because even you wrote the book a while ago.
Yes.
I think it's fascinating how actually it stood the test of time. And if you look at the conversations right now in market, I'm not sure if you're having the same, but I'm sure you are, of like, we need to evolve, we need to adapt. I'm really curious on what you're seeing there, and also the how, because I think it's really easy for us to be like, right, you know, sales is changing, AI is coming in, we need to adapt, we need to evolve. It's like, great, how?
Yeah.
And particularly when, you know, you look at any data point that's telling you the sellers are overwhelmed, they're burnt out, they're over it. So I really want to sort of unpack that a bit around how do we approach that right now?
I think I was guilty in my own career of not always taking opportunities when they were presented to me to develop myself, to develop my skills. It was like, oh no, that's sales training, that's enablement, I'm busy, I've got other stuff, I've got a quota, you know, that kind of thing, where you kind of start to believe your own bullshit a little bit. So I think there's an onus of responsibility on the individual, that we have to actually be responsible for our own relevance, if you want to call it that. So we can't just default to whatever training comes up. I might sit through, and that's gonna chart the course for the rest of my career. I think it's never been easier to learn. It's never been easier to sort of self-teach, to find out information. There's so many outlets available. So I think organizations have to take some responsibility in terms of not just throwing some mud against the wall, hoping some of it sticks each quarter. Oh, we're going to do some negotiation training, we're going to do this. It has to be targeted, it has to be specific, it has to be actionable. But then I think as individuals, you and I probably know plenty of people who were shining lights in their sales career 15 years ago, but have kind of continued to dine out on old successes and haven't been curious enough to wonder what's going to keep me relevant for the next period of time, have expected the things that made them successful to continue to make them successful. And they end up in a debt spiral of kind of crappier company, you know, smaller patch. Nobody cares about the stories of old. And that's not a nice place to be. And that's kind of, you know, the original Death of the Salesman, the play, that was exactly what that was about. You know, a salesman who'd done incredibly well and then aged and become less relevant over an extended period of time. So my big concern is, there's a lot of people out there who call themselves sales professionals. I think there's a tiny fraction of them who are actually professional in what they do. And I think that's the biggest challenge that we're going to have as an industry, is maintaining our relevance forces us to actually get out of our comfort zone. And some people are comfortable in their comfort zone.
So how do you encourage that? Because I feel like there's a level of like, as an organization, you can put on the right enablement that you think addresses the skill sets. You can invest in, you know, people like bringing yourself in. But there's also a level of like, bring the horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Yeah. And I'm really curious about that piece. Like, how do you ignite almost like that desire, that love of learning? Because I think everyone's trying the fear-mongering version of that, which is like, we're going to get left behind. Yeah. And it's not necessarily working. And I think that there's that piece is also missing in what I'm seeing. Yeah.
I don't profess to have, you know, a really nice soundbite answer to that question, but I think it's about recognizing that different people learn differently. And instead of having, you know, the 2-hour webinar or the 2-day offsite, we need to, you know, be able to give people bite-sized learning opportunities. We need to be creative enough to find different ways to do it. And also, I mean, one of the things I've always found really, really valuable is, you know, you're doing an offsite and people are like, oh yeah, okay, I'll come along to that. You know, we've got 4 customers who are going to be there, here, and here, and like, and everyone's in. And they're, you know, so it's being smart enough to understand what motivates certain individuals. You know, those who've been longer in their careers sometimes can be a little bit jaded, and I know this, and don't teach me how to suck eggs. So we have to take a different approach for those individuals. Sometimes that internal mentorship from more senior to more junior people can be really compelling as well. So I think it's not a one size fits all approach, but it is a recognition that people are learning differently. How you motivate them is different. Not everybody is coin operated. People think salespeople are all coin operated. They're not. So it's finding a balance of those things. And then I think the final thing is not just doing it as a point in time, which is here's the 2-day sales enablement. It's for the duration of your career in this organization, we're going to continue to invest in you in lots of different ways. whether you stay in those skills, work for you here, or you go somewhere else, we're still committed to developing you. And I think people will respond to that if they feel that you're not just trying to get your pound of flesh and get them to sell something more, but you're genuinely committed to their, to the longevity of their career.
Yeah, I agree with you on the micro learning. I'm seeing that work so much better. It's just like short, sharp, better attendance, better outcomes. And it's interesting you're sort of talking about this, because if you think about other professions, you have to keep up with professional development. You have to stay certified. You have to do it. And it's kind of one of my bugbears that in a way is kind of missing from sales.
Huge gap. I mean, I think it's almost the only profession I can think of where we call ourselves professionals, but we don't necessarily have any professional qualifications. We don't really commit to ongoing development. There's no bar or threshold that you have to meet and continue to meet. It's just, did you come in? Did you come in? Did you make your meeting? Like it's such a low bar to call ourselves professionals, and I ultimately think that's probably where the rubber hits the road. It's as all of this technology and AI and all of these other things come in around the edges, the old tasks are disappearing. The ones that used to keep everyone busy, they're disappearing. So what are you going to be doing? And so many of those things that we're going to be doing will probably have more of a human component to it than they did in the past. But that takes work. The soft skills take more work than the hard skills in many respects. So it's going to be really interesting. The next 2 or 3 years, I think it's going to be fascinating to see who steps up and who steps out.
What's your, if you were a betting man, you had to place your bets, what's your sort of, how do you think those next couple of years are going to play out?
I think I'm seeing something really interesting, which is maybe even almost kind of counterintuitive. And this is more from a customer lens, because a lot of the work that we do is talking to customers on behalf of vendors. So win-loss analysis. So, a large deal has just been won or lost. The vendor wants to know, why didn't you pick us? So my company goes in as an independent third party and interviews multiple stakeholders on the customer side. So it's fascinating because we get to peer behind the curtain and find out what really happened. And one of the things we're seeing is a frustration, particularly in the SaaS world, frustration on customers' behalf that it's you sell us something and you effectively disappear, and then you're just giving us access to like automated FAQs and bots on your website and whatever. And actually, we don't want software as a service. We want software with a service. And we expect that service to be a little bit of change management or some handholding or some onboarding or some whatever it might be. And so I think the role of sellers and customer success people to some degree as well will be more migrating towards that side. How do we get you to the outcome? Because I think a lot of customers have been very frustrated that they've paid for the inputs, but they haven't got the outcomes. So I'm seeing that change happening already. And when I talk to CEOs of SaaS companies and founders of SaaS companies and share that insight, they almost hug me because they're like, oh, that's exactly what we want to do. But a lot of those companies are in a challenging position because either they're VC backed or they're PE backed, or they're the bigger ones are on the stock market, and so they're trying to hit very specific ratios of margin and customer retention and a bunch of other things, which don't necessarily lend themselves to more service oriented support. But if you want to have sticky customers, if you want to have loyal customers, if you want to do the in inverted commas land and expand, they've got to be getting the value. They've got to be getting the outcomes. And so I think we're going to see sellers certainly in the complex end of the market navigate more towards the people-oriented skills that will build loyalty, build longevity. I mean, I think a customer is only a customer when they buy from us for the second time. The first time they buy, they're really just kind of dipping their toe in the water, giving us a chance, seeing what we're going to be like to work with. And if we, deliver on the promises that we've made at the start, then the invisible gates swing open, and that's where the real opportunity resides. But I think a lot of companies have missed that, and they're all in that kind of net new, white space, blue sky, and they're missing out on the long, valuable tail of just delivering on your promises.
That is fascinating. So how do you also guide then those CEOs or whoever you're speaking to, the CROs you're working with? Like, how do you bridge that gap? Because particularly I think for, I'm in my head thinking about some of the large organizations you work with, there's not necessarily always like an easy fix, because sometimes it might feel like moving the Titanic because there's structural changes that come with fixing that. So what's kind of, what's some of the stepping stones towards a better, greener grass?
Such a good question. And I might go back to answer this question to sort of explain the context of how I ended up in this weird area of this little niche within a niche in sales. So I was at SAP for many years, long, complex, high value, but also high cost of sale transactions. And I used to get so frustrated, after 9 months on a sales pursuit, when you'd get a 2-line email saying, hey, Cian, I'm sorry, we've decided to go with someone else. Or, like if it had been my choice, we would have definitely gone with you, but we've opted to hold off for another 3 years before.
You love that line. If it was my choice.
Yeah, absolutely. You're like, oh, you came a close second. I'd rather come 7th. So I used to get so frustrated with that. And so I would say to my, team, like, how are we going to find out what happened?
Yeah.
And they're like, well, we're going to go into a meeting room. We're going to sit down and we're going to create a plausible narrative for what we think happened. And then we're going to put that into CRM, and then we're going to move on to the next one. It was like, it was the craziest thing. I couldn't understand. We were putting so much time and effort and thought and money into these sales pursuits, and then we were just making shit up at the end.
Yeah.
And then I went and spoke to people at IBM and spoke to people at Oracle and said, how do you do your like post-sales analysis, your win-loss debriefs? And they're like, we kind of sit around in a room and we make shit up. I was like, oh my God, everyone's doing the same thing. So being the dumb Irish guy in the room, I was like, couldn't we just talk to our customers? And they're like, oh, what are you talking about?
Don't be silly, you're crazy.
It's ridiculous. So I was like, okay, all right, hypothetically, I'm just going to do this. So I started reaching out to some customers and said, look, is there any chance I could come in and spend half an hour, 45 minutes with you and just reverse engineer the buying journey that you've been on with us? Mm-hmm. And a bunch of them said yes. So I went in, I sat down with my, little like list of questions. What do we do here or whatever? And the stuff they told me made my head explode, because it was so far removed from what we thought had happened on these deals, like chalk and cheese. Like they were telling us stuff that wasn't even on our radar that had made the buying decision for them. And in a couple of cases, we had won deals and they were saying, it was like Stephen Bradbury, you were the worst, but then they fell over, and then they did that, and then they did that, and you were still the worst, but somehow you fell over the line. And it was like, it was a revelation. So I spoke to our CEO at the time and I said, look, I think we're missing a trick here. We should be doing this. And he said, I agree. Build it as a function. And so I started to do that. And I was like, I think I was ready to do something else, but also I felt you needed the independence. You needed the separation, both to allow the customer to be really candid and honest in that moment where they're giving the feedback, but also to your question, what do you do with the stuff you find out? Because some of it's structural, some of it's quite politically sensitive. And so the start of the journey was us conducting these really in-depth interviews and then going back to the vendors and saying, here's what your customer told us. And then one of the country managers said to me at one stage, what should I do with this? And I was like, well, whatever you want. And he was like, no, but I mean, specifically, what should I do? And I said, do you want us to interpret it for you? He said, yeah, that'd be great. Somebody went and spoke to our other customers and said, would you like us to interpret this? And they're like, yeah, that'd be great. Yeah. So they were like, okay. And that was the kind of the penny drop moment. It was like, nobody necessarily wants to do a win-loss program or put in a CRM. It's just like for our customers, they want the outcome. And the outcome is I want to win more. I want to understand why I'm losing to particular competitors. I want to improve my bid, no bid. I want to do all of these like quite specific things. So what we started to do then was we would capture all this really nuanced, thoughtful, interesting feedback from customers. We'd then interpret it and we say, this is our findings. This is how your customer said. This is the voice of customer that supports that. Here's our recommendations in terms of the things you might want to go away and fix. Now, if you do that on one deal, that's interesting, but it's really, once a quarter, you then level up the trends. You say, these are the 7 or 8 things that are repeating most often. This relates to your commercials, so that's something you can go away and fix. This relates to kind of, responsiveness or demos, so that's something you can fix. This is a product issue that's more structural. So if you're going to fix that, you may have to take that back to head office, and that's going to be a longer conversation. But it's giving them things that they can act on straight away to start to move the needle, and then some things that may take a little bit longer. But that is so much better than where most organizations find themselves, which is we don't know what we should focus on. So we sit around and we argue and then we make assumptions and then we throw some money at a couple of things and we cross our fingers and hope it's going to move the needle. To be able, and I've had so many boards and C-suites say, to be able to sit in a room and say, here's the 8 trends. No one's going to argue because we've had 15 customers who've, talked about these different topics. We have their feedback that supports that. And then we have an independent organization saying, do this next. This is who should own it. This is the priority you should put. It's just nice because then they can say, right, We don't have to argue. We can focus on that. And then I think from there, it's a kind of a traffic lighting exercise they do internally. It's like, what's the most important? What's the highest priority? What can move the needle most for us? Or how do we go from red is a negative experience? How do we turn that orange? How do we go from orange to green? How do we then make that consistent across the sales force? Because a rising tide lifts all boats. So that's the approach we take. It's not rocket science. It's actually really, really simple. My philosophy is if you've done a good job, you've earned the right to the feedback. We're leaving all of this gold sitting on boardroom tables up and down the country and all around the world. There's so much wastage that happens in our industry, like 10, 15 companies bidding for the same piece of work, all spending $250,000 on a pursuit. And then the vendor or then the customer decides, yeah, we might just hold off. And everyone's, that's like $5 million of cost of sale thrown away. And none of those companies are getting anything in return. So I actually think we need to hold ourselves to a higher standard. We need to set an expectation with our customers that if you want to spend our cost of sale, there's a trade-off here. And that trade-off is we need to get an in-depth debrief at the end of the process that we can learn from, we can extract some value from. That's the very least we should get in return for 6 months of effort and, hundreds of thousands of dollars of cost of sale. And the irony is customers are totally happy with that. Like, yeah, no problem at all. In you come, we'll tell you.
So you don't get many no's.
Very, very rare. Very rare you get no's. Sometimes you get, we won't talk about your competitors, or we won't go into, in-depth details around pricing and comparison, which is absolutely fine. Different organizations have a different sort of setting around probity and those kind of things, which is their prerogative. But the vast majority are very happy to do it because not only is it a professional courtesy, it's in their best interest to do it because they want choice in market. They want vendors that are going to sit and listen to them and then go away and take some action. And that's what you're committing to do if you do this exercise. So the biggest surprise, there's a ton of myths around this. There's so many companies that we've worked with and they're going, holy shit, how did you get them to say this? And we said, we just sat and we asked them. And because of the professional courtesy and because of the value they put on the partnership, the relationship with you, they were very open. They were very happy to do it. We just have this assumption that people won't do it. And somehow the entire B2B industry has kind of fallen for that lie. And, we work with all these huge organizations around the world. And they're like, we just never knew. We just never knew we could do this. It's like, well, you can. So there you go.
Do you think, because you've said there around, obviously you guys coming in as an independent, and I know from myself, when I was at IBM, you do various client debriefs, and some of the time I'd be sitting there going, oh my God, there's like just a giant elephant in the room here that's not being said. And whilst you try and ask it, it's ultimately, a more challenging conversation versus you as the third party that's independent. Yeah. Do you think that's some of the secret sauce is you're 100%. Removing away the person they've been dealing with?
It's the human icky, awkward factor of giving people direct feedback about them to them. Yeah. And what's ironic is, we've been doing this now for almost 15 years, and I could count on one hand the amount of times a customer has like really been negative about an individual. They're constructive and, they'll give some feedback that's constructive, but if they're taking the time to do it, almost always they're doing it with with the best interest of the vendor at heart. And more often than not, they've built a good relationship with multiple people on the sales team or the account team. And so they want to return some value back to them. So the awkward factor of having a conversation with someone where the feedback is about them, by removing that, they still know where they're representing the vendor. So it's, we're recording the conversation, we're doing all those kind of things, but it's just that individual or those people aren't in the room. So we can be a little bit more candid, honest. And particularly if you couch it in the right language, you say, look, this is why this organization wants to do this. They've spent $250,000. They just want to extract some value in return. I remember doing one, it was down in Circular Quay, and like 6 people from the customer came in to a boardroom in Circular Quay. So we tend to do it more remotely now, but back in those days, it was like face to face. And the vendor was there and they said, look, I'm going to step out. I just wanted to say thanks so much for coming in. We really, really appreciate the opportunity to do a professional debrief. Cian from Trinity is going to run the meeting. Our cost of sale was almost $500,000 on this pursuit. And so this is the one thing of value we're going to get. And then he stepped out and they literally nearly fell off their chairs because not one person on the customer side had even thought about cost of sale. It wasn't even on their radar. They didn't even occur to them. And they had like 7, 8 vendors who all jumped through hoops over Christmas and flew people in from all over the world. And the usual stuff. It didn't even occur to them that this was costing the vendor tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so that was like a truth serum. And those 6 individuals just talked and talked and talked and talked and told this organization so much. And they had a new product they just brought to market and they lost this pursuit. So now that gave them so much rich insight in terms of why were we in the lead? And then what happened? And then what happened? And how did our competitor do this? So now they had the playbook of their competitor. They knew where they'd missed the mark and they could go away and iterate. And they won a ton of business off the back of learning where they'd gone wrong. Most companies just aren't watching the game tape back.
Okay, so now I'm fascinated and I'm like dying to know. You've obviously done hundreds and hundreds of these. Yeah. Common themes that we need to look for. What are the sort of like, if you look across the board, the most common themes?
So let's talk about common loss themes first, I think, because, that's kind of always where everyone defaults to why are we losing, what's happening. I think generic, bland, boilerplate content response documents, RFIs, RFPs, RFQs, where you've clearly done a search and replace and then you didn't notice that it wasn't capitalized. So actually someone else's name has crept into the document and things like that. We've had some shocking examples. We had one example where...
I'm cringing so badly.
Oh, no, you're going to listen to this.
This is my worst nightmare. Like one of my biggest fears is like the wrong name, anything like that.
It gets so much worse. And this kind of almost segues perfectly into the next one. But we had one of my consulting team was conducting a review with a prospect that hadn't gone with a vendor, and they were doing it remote, and he was trying to explain that the prospect was saying, this is why we didn't pick this company. And he goes, can I share my screen? So my consultant was like, yeah, share screen. He goes, so this is their response document. Somebody turned on track changes and wrote in the margin, we've just made up these case studies. I've just made up these. And someone else said, that's okay, just put them in anyway. And then they PDF'd it with the comments on and sent that as their final product to the customer. So which segues in to unprofessional, unethical, dumb things still happen all the time. So you get generic, bland, boring, whatever, which is a ticket to the dustbin. Then you get people doing the wrong thing because most of the time, because they're too busy, they're chasing too many opportunities, they're spinning too many plates. And you and I both know things slip through the cracks in that scenario. Now that story is unprofessional, unethical as well. But there's a bunch where it was just people were busy and they messed up. So those two things, I think. Lack of compelling win themes, nothing that really differentiates you. We know if we're doing a review and someone says it was an apples for apples comparison, we know that none of those vendors have done their job because they haven't been able to find out things in their discovery that are really critical to this particular customer or to the program of work, and then align them to things that they do really well as an organization and create genuine win themes that are differentiated, that resonate, test those with their internal sponsor and weave those into the narrative of the engagement. So I think they're some of the issues we see. Not being able to build strong internal sponsorship or, stakeholder engagement which has been really interesting in the post-COVID era, particularly for companies that spend more time selling online, because you might have 10 meetings, but if you're not face to face with people, it's actually quite hard to get beyond that sort of, that sort of corporate, professional, appropriate conversation to the human behind. So therefore, it's actually quite hard to build that kind of internal sponsor, the person that will have the conversation with you before the meeting starts or the one afterwards where they tell you why that person was sitting back with their arms folded. And in complex deals, you need those stakeholders over an extended period of time. So I think, I could talk for the next hour and a half about why we lose and consistent themes, but that's a couple. If you flip the coin and why we win, I think one of the things we see is like genuine thought leadership. Organizations that are kind of leading the charge in their particular vertical, their particular space, they're giving away a little bit of their IP, a little bit of their secret sauce to the degree that people are going, this is really interesting. This is kind of, cutting edge. And so you're now seeing more than just a vendor. You're seen as a subject matter expert, an authority on a topic. Organizations and individuals proactively come to you. And so I think that's a really interesting one. I'm seeing more CEOs now stepping up and starting to sort of build a personal brand within an organizational brand, which I think is really interesting. And I think it's a good thing because they will get cut through much more so than a corporate brand ever will. So that's one. I think just some basic things. Like if I'm talking to any sales team now, I'm saying, risk has jumped to the top of the food chain by a country mile in terms of the most critical decision criteria. Every single organization we talk to, if it's a meaningful dollar value of an opportunity, it's risk. But the thing that I've learned, which is fascinating, is risk isn't just organizational, it's personal. There's a lot of people who are putting their personal or professional brand on the line or currency on the line if they make a buying decision in your favor. So you've got to find ways to understand, manage, mitigate, share risk with customers that we didn't have to do 3 or 4 years ago. If you're the safest pair of hands in the current environment, you're putting yourself in a really, really strong position to win. And if you can do better discovery, wrap that into win themes and be the safest pair of hands, you're in a really, really good position. Like, price is always there, but I think value is more important than price. So price is just a line item. And one of the really interesting things I've learned over the years is that product and price gets you from the long list to the short list. And then the quality of your people and your purpose gets you from short list to being selected as vendor of choice. Because ultimately, once you're on the short list, you've kind of ticked the boxes. Then they're going, who are we going to be working with? Have they done this before? What do they like to work with? They will back channel to their own network. So referrals have become a lot less important, and peer-to-peer is kind of jumped out. That's the only trusted information source less. People trust feedback from peers and colleagues. So how we navigate that is really, really important to us as well. And if you can do those things, you're putting yourself in a strong position. Ironically, everyone's a bit gun shy about change at the moment. So incumbents are managing to hold on to positions in organizations that they probably shouldn't, because it's seen as a path of least resistance to stick with them. So if you're going head to head against an incumbent, you've got to be looking at what's not just the kind of the potential impact of change, what's the value of change, and what's the impact of doing nothing, and then how can we de-risk that? And we're seeing some vendors be super smart about incumbent swap outs and what they can do to de-risk that, and what they can do to look like a much, much better option, and how they can just help organizations sell internally. And that's the other thing, which is really fascinating to me, is that so much of the selling happens when we're not in the room. So how do we set up our key sponsors to sell on our behalf internally to the board, to the other stakeholders when we're not in the room? And I think that in itself is a hugely important skill set that senior sellers need to nail.
Oh, there are so many things in that. There's like 20,000 things I want to circle back on. If I pick a couple, I want to come back to the differentiation one, because I'm seeing that as interesting right now. Yeah. I agree with you. You've got to be differentiated. But then what I often find when you're talking to teams around, okay, what are some of our differentiators? I get the fact so let's take we both work in IT a lot, right? Yeah. We might all be positioning one of the same vendor solutions. So it's not like, we've got completely different, there's relative similarities on the table. And what I'm finding is when you then are really trying to challenge people to like pull out the juice of what's different, everyone's like, well, we've got deep technical expertise. We've got 25 years in business. No one gives a monkeys. We've got so many vendor accreditations. Yeah. And so then you line them up and you look at it and you're like, you look, feel, sound exactly the same. And I get it. Like, I've been the other side. Yeah. When I was at IBM, I well and truly drank the Kool-Aid, completely believed wholeheartedly everything I was saying was truly different, because it totally was. And then you kind of come the other side of the fence and you look and you compare and you're like, you all look, feel, sound the same. So how do you kind of really try and tease some of that out? And if you're like me 10 years ago when you were drinking the Kool-Aid, how do you kind of get out of your head on that?
I think the first thing I would say is I call complete bullshit on USPs, right? Because it's only unique if it's relevant to the customer. Yeah. And this is where I think a lot of particularly younger salespeople who've drunk the Kool-Aid fall down. It's that, it becomes like a kind of a show up and throw up or a, here's what we do, the song and the dance and whatever. That's not relevant. You don't have a solution until you've diagnosed the problem. And if you do a really good diagnosis of the problem, then you'll work out what's most relevant to this particular organization. And then you take the things from your solution or product or service or go to market or your service offering, whatever it is, and you align 2 or 3 of them to the mission critical things of this organization, and then they become unique, then they become differentiated, and you test that with a company or the key stakeholders. Like, if we were to, hypothetically, if we could, those 3 things, if we could do it, where would that put us? Now, like, we'd rip your arm off, we'd get started next week. You go, okay, now we've got something which is a genuine point of differentiation. How do we tie back to that? So I think USP, it's just nonsense. It doesn't make any sense, because it has to change from customer to customer, dictated by the circumstances of that organization. If you get that bit right, then they will be reading your executive summary like they've written it. You'll be playing back to them what they've told. Customers will teach us how to sell to them if we show up and we ask good questions and we listen. Like we did a really interesting exercise a couple of years ago. We did a research piece called The Mood of the B2B Buyer. And we went out and asked all these customers about their experiences working with salespeople, like the good, the bad, and the ugly. And then at the very end, we sort of just threw a last question over the fence. We said, what one bit of advice would you give to salespeople? And 2 words came back consistently across all of these different buyers. They said, like, listen and understand, listen and understand. And I think we rush to solution mode far, far too quickly, which means the discovery gets thrown out of the window and, we're desperate to sell something. We've got to, that anxiety, that desperation to sell something is the worst possible thing for salespeople. So when I talk to young sellers, I say, just focus on earning the right to move to the next step of the process and do an absolutely incredible job at each interaction. And that will earn you the right. And the deal will take care of itself, because that's a means to an end. For us, we get fixated on the deal. Customers don't care about that. The outcome 4 steps after the deal is what they care about. So if we get fixated on the outcome, more often than not, we'll be in the same headspace as the customer and will increase our probability. So I think that's one of the big challenges. But yeah, USP, total nonsense. It has to change from customer to customer. Otherwise, it's just meaningless marketing bump.
Yeah. The other one I want to unpack that you talked about was risk. You said about sharing the risk.
Yeah.
And this is a really interesting one, because I know sometimes when I've tried to, structure complex deals, there's degrees to which you can guarantee or not, or various wording around that. So how are you seeing shared risk work? Because you talked about that being one of the common win themes.
Yeah, and look, I think just to pick up on your first point, I come from that world as well, where risk, puts off kind of buzzing lights in our brain, and we start thinking about revenue recognition challenges and all of these kind of things. The first thing I would say is we've got to sacrifice some sacred cows when it comes to our own relationship with risk internally as vendors, because the whole landscape is shifting. So, I've seen some companies be really, really smart, and they create a joint risk roadmap with a customer early on in the piece. And they sit down, they talk about, transformation risk. They talk about security risk. They talk about, key man or key woman risk. They talk about a bunch of other, and they look at the risk appetite, because some organizations have a much higher risk appetite and they're willing to lean in and be early adopters. Others are much less comfortable doing that. I'm seeing vendors do other really smart things where they say, particularly if it's an incumbent swap out, they say, okay, there's going to be a risk associated with this. So this is how we're going to unpack those risk factors and then defray them. So we'll give you 6 months where you can run a sandpit area with our solution and their solution in parallel. We're going to do this, and this, and just make it really easy for them to go, sigh of relief. You've thought about all this stuff. You've done it before. We'll introduce you to customers where we've swapped out from the same vendor, so you can talk to them about their experiences. And it just feels much more bespoke. It takes the heat out of it. It allows them to sit in front of their board and say, this organization has done this 10 times. We've spoken to those customers. They had an amazing experience. We hate our incumbent. Now we've got an option to move. So I think we've just got to have a different posture when it comes to risk. And it's a challenge. And again, particularly for younger sellers, I was super uncomfortable talking about risk in my early years. A, because I didn't understand it. B, because I didn't know what I could say without getting us, kind of in trouble. C, because I was worried about revenue recognition. And probably D, because there was a bunch of lawyers saying, don't talk about any of those things. And then we lose a deal. So I think we've got to, at an executive level, look at this and say, if risk is the number one decision criteria for an awful lot of companies at the moment, where do we think we stack up, on the risk scorecard? Is there more we could do? We've got to go back and look at things that were maybe sacrosanct and we could never talk about, and say, are our competitors talking about these things in market? Are they building in milestone payments versus one-off? Are they doing, there's a lot more focus on outcome-based. If you look at so many AI and agentic solutions that are coming to market, it's based on outcomes rather than inputs. I think nobody wants to be, the BlackBerry. We've got to maintain our relevance, and to do that, we've got to keep looking back at our pricing model. We've got to look back at all of the other things that maybe in the past we wouldn't have entertained, and be willing to have those conversations.
Yeah, I agree with that one entirely. If I'm a CRO sitting here listening right now and I'm really like, right, that's it. And even though we've given a lot of B2B examples, this could be I'm losing gym members, or I'm gaining them. It could be any sort of different type of business. But if I'm a CRO listening right now and I go, right, that's it, I'm moving away from either A, not doing it at all, or B, the variety of just like box ticking win and loss reviews. What's the kind of practical stepping stones to get started?
I think there's probably three things I'd say there. The first question is like, what are your deal values and how much complexity is in your pursuits? Because if your deal values are relatively low and there's not a huge amount of complexity in that, there's probably a platform solution. So we developed a SaaS platform a couple of years ago. There's quite a few other SaaS platforms in the market, which is kind of almost like a survey on steroids that aligns to the buying journey that your customer has been on. And so you can adopt a tool. You can set an expectation with the customer early in the sales cycle that win, lose, or draw, we really would love to get some feedback. And that's kind of the exchange of value here. If you set that expectation, the hit rate's much higher. We've never advocated for, giving people coffee cards or exchanging something tangible, because you don't need to, because if you run a decent sales cycle, you've earned the right to that feedback. So if it's kind of, at the less complex end of the market, there's a bunch of tools out there, including ours, that can do that. If it's at the more complex end of the market, then it needs to be conversational. It needs to be interview based in our experience. So the first question any CRO needs to answer is, do we do this ourselves, or do we bring in an independent third party? And there's pros and cons to both. There's obviously cost implications if it's an independent third party. People are sometimes a little bit uncomfortable about airing their dirty laundry in public, so they kind of think that maybe it makes more sense to do it. The challenge with that is usually nobody owns it as a full-time gig. It's, something else you do. You lose the independence, which makes it harder for the customer to give the feedback, and also harder for you to do something with those insights. It's not consistent. It tends not to sort of add up, and then it will kind of drop away at a certain point in time. At least that's been our experience. I think the other thing to think about, and this is a really interesting one, is if you're a CRO or senior leader or the board are saying, the senior leadership is saying, why did we win this? Why did we lose this? And no one can give them a straight answer on that. So that's a really interesting gap to have in an otherwise exceptionally professional company. Top of funnel has been optimized for the last decade, and bottom of funnel has been neglected. And suddenly everyone's turning, going, because in good times, you don't really have to worry about why are we winning and losing, because there's enough to go around and everyone's killing it and it's all great. That's not the case anymore. Suddenly the board, C-suite, and everyone down the food chain is being asked, why are we losing? Well, and they're being told, drop down from CRM, we lost on this. Like, there's so much value being left behind. So CROs need to look at that, and they need to say, geez, we're missing a huge trick here. Like, we've worked with some companies where they've had $100 million of additional revenue attribution based on learning why they lost deals, and then going in and doing second and subsequent pieces of work with those same clients and winning. They lose phase 0, but they win phase 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and that's $30 million, $40 million. And they do that a couple of times, and they're like, oh my God, how are we missing this? So there's so much value being left behind that you've earned with your cost of sale that will set you up for a longer term relationship with those clients. I think there's just a slow but steady realization from people going, yeah, we might have misjudged this one. And so I was just kind of out there banging that drum for 15 years. And in the last 2 or 3 years, it's like the band is formed around, and everyone else is starting to bang the drum as well, which is nice.
Yeah. And there's so much value, like you said, because it often gets missed, or you get a box ticking answer. Correct. Or I know I did loads like early on in my career where it's like, oh geez, I've got to do this admin. Yeah. And like you're just sort of doing it as quickly as you humanly can and then sending it off.
Correct.
And you've also got your own personal bias. You're too close to it. It's subjective. Correct. It's your bias.
Well, someone said to me recently, and I wish I'd said it because it was such a smart thing to say, it's like, you're marking your own homework. And it was the perfect way to articulate what it is. And you know what's really interesting is you take all of the C-suite leadership out of the equation. If you've carried a quota and you've lost a big deal, that's one of the worst things that can happen, and it happens all the time. But if you can at least learn from that, and this comes back to what I was saying at the start about being a professional, right? If you're a professional in sport, you win, you lose. You watch the game tape back, you learn from that. You look for the 1 or 2% that you can improve upon. You get incrementally better over an extended period of time. You get some really good coaching, and that's everyone just accepts that as the norm. We call ourselves professionals, but we don't do that. We don't watch the game tape back. We don't find those 1 or 2% of incremental benefit. We don't get coached on it. And then we make the same mistakes again, and we don't, we ask ourselves, well, why did I lose that one? Well, you didn't know why you lost the one before. You don't know why you're going to lose this one or the next one. It's just patently ridiculous. And the irony is, all of the information is there. It's available. Customers will give it to us. We can capture it. We can use it. We can learn from it. And I would say Gartner just released their second win-loss vendor white paper. And I think it's still, probably only about 18% penetration in the global B2B market of companies that are doing anything really consistent around win-loss. And then I would say there's a smaller subset within that are really learning from and applying the insights, because a lot of times it gets given to product marketing. Product marketing, you're told, oh, this is your baby. And nothing against product marketing. They do a great job. But if it isn't being owned by sales leadership, then they won't see the inherent value in the data. And so it'll just sort of get swept under the carpet.
Yeah. And then I have to ask the obvious question that's the talking point at the moment. Sorry to say it. It's like a golden buzzer.
AI.
Thank you. How do you think that's going to shape the win-loss review process?
It's been a game changer for us already because, well, two things. First of all, when you capture, let's say if we look at the two offerings, so in the more survey end of the market, you can capture feedback, right? And you can get that relatively easily, assuming that people will respond. But that might sit on a balanced scorecard somewhere or an executive dashboard somewhere, but actually doesn't really fundamentally move the needle, because the people who are getting it want to know, what should we do with this? So you've got to interpret it for them if it's going to be really meaningful. But if they're doing hundreds or thousands of reviews, how do you interpret that at scale? Well, AI is the perfect tool to do that, because it can aggregate that information quickly. It can tease out the trends. It can pull voice of customer out, so it can give you quantitative, qualitative. It can give you voice, video. It can parse all of those really quickly. It can also look at all the prior trends and see what's working, what's not. You can also embed like if this, then that. So if this finding, then that recommendation, based on everything that company has done, but also what's happening more broadly in the industry. So you can give them something really tangible on an individual deal level, but also on a trend analysis across all of their deals in real time or in close to real time. That's like, we hand those things over to people and they're just going, holy shit, how did you do that? How did you do that so fast? How did you get them to say those things? And that's exactly what you want as a response. But if you look at the upper end of the enterprise market, human in the loop with AI is the perfect mix there. So you've got a large complex deal. You've got senior stakeholders. They need to be talking to someone who is, knowledgeable, has domain expertise, has seniority and tenure. But then how do you, take 3 or 4 interviews and turn that into something really meaningful, and then level that up into trends, and then take that right around the world? AI is great. You've got individual large language models per customer. You can ingest all of their prior win and loss reviews. You can get your baseline, and then you can start to do that. And then you have a little bit more human in the loop to do some of the finessing and the nuancing. It's just the perfect tool to work in both those use cases. And so it's been a game changer for us over the last 18 months.
So the money shot is actually still just combining that AI and that human piece.
Yeah, certainly at the top end of town it is. Yeah. I think, further down the food chain. But the human in the loop piece there is the customer. And that's the bit that's been missing for so many organizations. They've been trying to work this stuff out. And, customers knocking at the door saying, I have the answers. No, don't worry. It's all right. We don't need you. And for decades, we've been doing this as industry, and it's just patently ridiculous. And now it's becoming, I think, a little bit more mainstream, a little bit more understood. People are like, okay, we missed this. We all missed this, so we don't feel too bad, but we're going to fix it.
So if there was a first step you wanted to leave leaders with, we sort of touched on it a little bit, but we've covered so much ground. If we were going to leave leaders with, right, first step from here, go, do it today. What's your first move?
I think it would be, that's a really good question. Let me think about this for a second. I think there has to be a realization that we're leaving tons of value behind. Like as an industry, we toss around ROI, return on investment, all this sort of stuff all the time. But we look at it from the perspective of how, talking to our customers, how are we going to give you return on investment? And we're kind of like the carpenter or the plumber that's, really, really good at what they do, but they come home and their shelves are falling down, their bathroom's flooding or whatever. We aren't actually very good at delivering ROI internally in our own businesses. So as a CRO, you've got to kind of, you wear a couple of different hats. You're responsible for like hitting revenue targets and increasing revenue targets, but also about getting your house in order to be able to do that. This to me is probably the biggest missed opportunity, the most available value for the least amount of investment. So I think there has to be a kind of an internal conversation around, are we doing this? Why aren't we doing this? Who should own it? And then run an experiment, do it for 6 months, do it, whatever, and give yourselves an opportunity, because more and more vendors are doing it now. So it was a nice to have a year or two ago. It's gradually becoming a must have, and it'll rapidly become, if you don't do it, you're actually behind the pack.
Yeah, you don't want to be the one that hasn't done it and everybody else is doing it.
Well, because,
getting the competitive
because they're
advantage.
that's exactly right. They're getting your playbook.
Yeah.
Like, so you win a deal against a competitor. If they're doing win-loss, you have to assume you can't win the next deal the same way, because they now know where their soft underbelly is. They now know where you're positioning. They will be smart enough to pivot their strategy. And that's what professionalism is all about. It's about leveling up. And so I think more companies are starting to do that now. I'm fascinated to see which ones are the laggards and which ones are the early adopters.
Love it. I am 100% in. I have to ask you one final question before I let you go, on a completely different train of thought. I am the crazy book lady, known for being the crazy book lady. Love it. If there was a book other than your own, because that's cheating, business book that you find yourself recommending the most, what would it be?
Well, so I'll answer that twofold. I'm reading a book at the moment called Careless People, which is the lady who ran the sort of political wing within Facebook, in terms of how do they navigate the whole political spectrum. It's one of the most fascinating, interesting, bizarre books I've probably ever read in my life, because it just shows kind of what's happening behind the scenes in large corporates and stuff that people who've been working in large corporate for a long period of time would completely relate to. So that is one that's out at the moment, which is really fascinating. In terms of business books, there's a really good book. I'm just trying to think of the name of the author. What is his name? It's about presentation skills and what's your message, by a guy called Cam Barber. And I think communication skills is something we expect all of our sellers and sales leaders and leaders to have. And some of them are good at it and some of them are appalling at it. And they stand up and they leave their personality in the chair. And you're like, well, hang on, you're actually quite a nice person, but you've just gone into robot mode. And this book, I loved reading it because the central premise to what's your message is message transfer is the only kind of barometer for success for anyone who's presenting. So you can be, 4 pens across your top pocket and like a total lunatic, but if you can communicate your message in a way that people can understand it, retain it, and retell it to others, then you've done your job. And I think that's so important for salespeople because, as I said earlier, so much of the selling is happening when we're not in the room. So our ability to articulate things in a way that are compelling, that makes sense to the client, that they can retain and repeat, and probably weave in stories and do that, I think is back to the question about AI. That's somewhere we can continue to differentiate and add value because AI won't be doing that for a long time. So I think we need to double down on the human skills. And so, communication is probably top of the food chain for those.
I love it. Cian, if our audience wants to connect with you, and I have no idea why they wouldn't, I think everyone will be flooding your direction. Where are they best to come and find you?
So you can head to the Trinity website, which is usetrinity.com, or head over to LinkedIn. I occasionally post the odd bit of content on there when the mood takes me. And all my contact details are there as well. So yeah, always happy to have a conversation.
Thank you so much. I feel like there's still 20,000 questions in my head. We'll probably have podcast 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 coming up.
I look forward to it.
But thank you for being an amazing guest.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me, Abbie.
If you would like to receive micro-learning direct to your inbox, then check out our REV UP Shots. It's an espresso shot of learning direct to your inbox once a week. Pick your ingredients, whether you want to learn about prospecting, AI, or some of the topics we've covered today, and then once a week, it'll arrive directly to your inbox. If you enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to subscribe and follow so that you get our unfiltered conversations every single week.